Hello to everyone who's watching this video right now. My name is Francesco Leoni. I am a PhD candidate at the Department of Design at Politecnico di Milano in Milan, Italy. My contribution for the Data for Policy 5th International Conference is number 123. And in the next minutes, I'm going to briefly present the article I have submitted. The title of my submission is Design for Policy in Data for Policy Practices, Exploring Potential Convergences for Policy Innovation. So you can tell already by the title that the point is try to connect different worlds and different communities together in order to understand if there is any room for integration and for conversation between the two. The article is very much about advancing an argument about connecting these two different fields. And what I mean by fields is a sort of conceptualization of a group of people, researcher and practitioner, which are working perhaps as epistemic communities in separate way in order to enhance and innovate how the public sector work, how governments work, and how policymaking is made. So through many different events, the design for policy and data for policy fields are building knowledge and presenting cases in order to investigate how it's possible to innovate policymaking. So I'll try to briefly present both fields. One for sure is data for policy, which is also the one mostly exemplified by the conference, which we are participating right now. And the data for policy field looks at the intersection between the use of data, especially non-traditional type of data, but also data which were already existing and which are used in another fashion, in another manner. For example, that would be the case for data which are already in the public sector but are integrated in a different way. Or it could be the case, for example, about data collaboratives in which the public sector and the private sector might engage in a new type of collaboration in order to share data which are needed in order to develop analysis. So the type of innovation that the data for policy field is looking for is how this type of new practices interact with policymaking. And for example, the case I'm showing here, Piano Casa Italia, is an interesting case of using of administrative data and data from the municipality of Italy in order to address the problem of risk assessment for earthquakes in buildings in Italy. And this policy, this use of data into policy has been promoted by a department in the Italian government, which is called Dipartimento Casa Italia, which was invested with the mission of using this data in order to address the problem of earthquakes, especially after the events of some years ago in the central regions of Italy. The design for policy field, on the other hand, is a field in which the investigation is focused on the use of approaches, methods, and tools which are normally used in the design practice and are applied into governments and public sector. Is a type of field which manifested itself very much through the use of this new design contribution to the public sector into innovation labs and public sector innovation lab in government. So we could say that very much manifested through practice rather than theory, and is focused on a series of different innovative way of working in the policymaking and in policymaking and in public service development. The focus is on a creative approach using abduction logic in order to address public problems, and also the main focus, as it would be in the design practice, is about try to work by keeping in mind what would be the experience, what would be the needs of the final user of policies and services. So that's why it's been called also a human-centered approach to governance and policymaking. It's an approach that values very much experimentation, and as in the design practice, many techniques are used in order to engage with people and start a dialogue and try to get this the contextual and local knowledge that different stakeholders might have in order to improve and enhance the process of policymaking. It seems like there is quite a lot of interest in connecting the data for policy part and the design for policy part. And we can see that in the practical experimentation of labs and innovation units, as for example is the case for the UK Policy Lab, which is working in the UK Government Cabinet Office, which claim to use big data and fake data, so ethnographic data, for example, in their project in order to understand the whole picture on one side and then zoom in and make it clear why something happened, for example, on the other side. Another example comes from the United Nations Pulse Lab in Jakarta, which is devoted to the use of data in order to bring innovation in governments and in development in general. And they have recently expressed also through Medium that the use of human-centered and service design approaches help them to use data in a better way in order to advance their research and better understand what are the issues they want to tackle. If on one hand we have all these differences that we have seen, briefly seen before, on the other we have a certain interest in the groundwork to integrate those two fields and the relative approaches, tools and techniques that comes along with them. Perhaps one common point to start in order to see if there is possible way to explicitly integrate those two fields together is the idea that they both work toward making policy more innovative. So policy innovation should be the common point, but policy innovation is a concept that should be first understand in a broader context. And that broader context is public sector innovation. So public sector innovation itself is a complex framework, perhaps, and also a little bit fuzzy in terms of definition, because is a field that seeks to innovate in order to bring public value to citizens. So bringing and implementing new solution in the public sector in order to have better value and more public value for citizens. And if we look at the literature, we see that it is a field under development, although is quite old in terms of the discussion on how to improve and innovate government. More recently, this field has tried to move away from what has been the traditional literature in innovation, which regards the private sector and technological development and product development, in order to differentiate itself and by doing so, try to understand what are the specific type of innovation which makes it different. So we have many types of innovation in the public sector. One of them is policy innovation, which itself has to be a little bit explored in order to understand what it means. So policy innovation, what it is. If we look at the literature on and search for a meaning on policy innovation, we could see quite a different range of meaning. Going back to accounts in political science and policy studies, we see that policy innovation is has a quite particular definition, in the sense that it's not really about inventing new policies, but more about adopting policy which are relatively new, in the sense that they didn't exist in that context before. So if a policy is implemented in a certain government and then is going to be adopted in another government, let's say in another national state, that would be policy innovation according to those definition. And that's because policy very often in that perspective are not invented, but rather are let's say imitated among different governmental settings. So if that on one hand could be seen as one way to see policy innovation, on the other hand we have a much earlier account that see policy innovation as a type of innovation that works with the understanding and beliefs of a certain community of people, or rather a certain network of actors and stakeholders, which are working in, which are tied together in a policy-making process. And innovation would regard how they conceive and they understand what are the goals, what are the needs, and what are the way in which the policy could be implemented. I decided to talk a specific perspective on a policy innovation, borrowing from Watts and Prendeville, as not a type of innovation that resembles product innovation, but rather a type of innovation which is much more about process innovation. So new way of developing policies instead of a policy that is new to the state adopting it. And if the common point between the two fields is policy innovation, seen not only as new policy, but also as new way of developing public policies, we should ask ourselves what that exactly means. How can we, even if we decide to see policy innovation as a process innovation, how can we really look into into each field and see connection? So my proposal goes further in seeing policy innovation as a process, but also as a innovation in the way policy learning happens. Policy learning is a field in policy studies and political science dealing with how learning happens in policy and how this affects policy change and policy innovation. And the advantage of using this perspective when we see policy innovation as a process is that policy learning has been already defined as a process which happens on the micro, meso, and macro level. And that could help if we use learning dynamics to see policy innovation. That could help also to understand why a certain innovation happening on the micro level can affect if it's an innovation about learning, how this can also affect learning on the macro level. So if we are talking about a new process or a new way of using data, which is enhancing learning on the micro level, we can try to understand how that innovation also affected the macro level, as we are seeing this through the lens of learning. So how that enhanced learning on the micro level and how that enhanced learning on the macro level. So the proposal is to see, once again, policy innovation as a process of innovative ways of developing policy, but also innovative way of learning in the policy making process. And given that that conceptual premise, I tried to, in the article, to propose some areas of convergences, and in order to ground them with real case examples, I have performed a review of the literature in the past data for policy conferences through coding with the help of qualitative analysis software. And I reviewed 74 articles which were present on the Zenodo platform. And I use this coding in order to find what could be common point between in data for policy practice that could work as areas of convergence also for the design for policy field. So in the article, I proposed 3 different areas of convergence, and those areas are shaped around a perspective that looks at learning for the reason I explained before. And for each of those areas, I found in my review some illustrative example coming from the Data for Policy conference, which are meant to ground those areas with real case examples. So the first one is learning from data-driven anticipatory governance, and is based on the idea that both fields address futures and possible futures in a different way. In the design for policy field, future is very much about involving user, talking and discussing about possible future in order to see how they feel about those future, in order to use that knowledge to drive the process of design of services or policy. And in the data for policy field, future is also very important. Anticipation is very important because the use of past data can be matched with predictive analytics in order to see what could happen based on past data. So I think there are at least 2 ways in which we could see, and this is something I found some example about, there are at least 2 ways in which we can see an integration. If on the one hand, the design for policy approach toward future is much more related to involving people in anticipation activity, that could help the development of data infrastructure and data management, because it could be in that way it could be possible to learn how people feel about having those data collected. And that was, for example, the case of using design fiction method for addressing participatory IoT research in a paper presented by Jacobs in the last Data for Policy conference. So they use narrative prototypes to engage with people and understand how they feel about data collection in a specific context in England. And that could be one way to integrate the 2 fields. Another way could be to, as in the project of the lab Fields of View in India, it could be to integrate both quantitative and qualitative data in a specific context in order to see, in order to build a scenario prediction technology that could tell what are the possible outcome in a specific context. So we could see here two different type of example on how data-driven anticipatory governance could become a way to integrate design for policy and data for policy, and giving shape to hub for learning and to understand more about what are the policy problems. A second area of learning is about the one trait that is very important in design for policy, which is the gathering and collection of local and contextual knowledge in order to enhance public service and policy making. So in past Data for Policy conference, I found example of techniques and methods that were used, for example, to engage with a community, but at the same time rethink the data ontologies, meaning the structure, the semantic structure through which real life problem and phenomenon are translated into data and data sets. The engaging of people through participatory method could be a way to integrate local knowledge and rethink the semantic of those problems and rethink the data ontologies in order to have a better and richer understand of policy relevant matter. And so this could be a way to integrate both the data for policy field and the design for policy field in a way which is valuable for each one of them. The third area I propose as an area of convergence is called learning from service systems. So service systems are a complex ensemble of people and technology that are meant to provide a service to a certain user. And from those service systems, we can collect data and service data for to inform policymaking, and that could be quite relevant. At the same time, existing closed service systems needs to be integrated together, and to integrate them, we need to understand, for example, what could be a user journey. So this specific perspective on exploring different service systems in order to learn and collect data from them, it could be a point of convergence, since in the design for policy field, for example, service design techniques and methods have been used to understand how a specific user behave and act within services already existing. So if we can use this mapping activity also in the with a perspective of integrating different data through different service, that could be a relevant way for to learn about a policy relevant context, even if very complex, and try to make a new informational infrastructure. On the other hand, if we have a data for policy perspective, we can also try to incorporate data collection point in the service design activity beforehand, in order to have a feedback loop which will give relevant data from the service to policymaker in order to understand how a policy is performing. And for example, there is a quite interesting example in the New South Wales Stronger Communities Investment Unit in Australia, an initiative called Their Futures Matter. in which a certain social policy is implemented through many different services, and data are collected in those services and feedback into the system in order to understand and predict how the investment about certain social categories can be steered and directed for the better. So, and with that last area of convergence that I propose, I like to thank you and end my presentation. And I'm looking forward to have a fruitful conversation with you at the Data for Policy 2020 conference. And thanks for your time in listening and watching this video.